Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. Today I'm really excited. I'm sitting down with Dr. Lewis Potter, who is the creator of Geeky Medics. Now, if you've never heard of Geeky Medics, you are living under a rock because it is an incredible learning platform that goes through clinical skills, assessment, OSCEs, everything for any and all types of clinicians, from nurses, paramedics, student doctors, everything. So it is a fantastic learning platform. So I'm super excited to sit down with you today, Dr. Lewis. So thank you so much for joining. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and talk about a bit about Geeky Medics, what got you into it, and what it offers?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Alex. So I'm Lewis, and I'm currently a GP trainee. I've been a doctor for 10 years now, but still not quite done. And I founded Geeky Medics 12 years ago now, back when I was a med student, and I'm still working on it today alongside training, which has been in equal parts really fun, but also intensely challenging, balancing things. And you've kind of described Geeky Medics for what it is. So it's sort of an online platform where you focus largely on clinical skills. So, how-to guides, how to, do a cardio exam or approach an ABCD assessment. And I film videos demonstrating those skills and edit them. And then we have them on YouTube and on geekymedics.com, and all that stuff is free. We do have some things that are paid, but largely you can get most of the value, to be honest, from our free elements. So I founded it back when I was a fourth year med student, because at that time, it's hard to believe really, but there was quite a limited amount of medical education content online that was sort of freely accessible, which is totally different now. And there's a million sources, and really we're spoiled for choice, I guess. But at that point, there wasn't. And the height of technology at the time was people creating Word documents and sharing them with each other, which was quite tedious. And I was a bit of a techie geek and liked tinkering with that stuff. And I actually initially started Geeky Medics because I thought I was going to do a podcast back 12 years ago. Podcasting had just sort of launched. And I thought, you know what, this podcasting might be a big thing. So I registered the geekymedics.com for that, because the idea was that it'd be a bunch of geeky medics chatting about, medic stuff and technology. But I recorded one episode and it was really bad. So I decided that my future didn't lie in being the host of a podcast. Unlike you, Alex, I just didn't have those natural skills. So I scrapped it, but I still had geekymedics.com because I'd, paid for a year for the URL. And then because I was working on blogs and I was writing notes, I kind of thought, you know what, I can do the blog thing that I was thinking about, and I'll use geekymedics.com as the URL and see how it goes. And created the blog, and then quickly realized that whilst, a written guide to how to do a cardiovascular exam is all well and good, it would be really nice to also have a video demonstration. And I was kind of into video production myself because I'd been involved in my school's drama club, and I wasn't a very good actor, but they let me film and edit the productions as a sort of way to get me away from the acting. And turned out I really enjoyed doing that stuff. So I decided I would sort of buy a camera and get a mic, and convinced two friends who were also med students with me to play doctor and patient. And we recorded the first two videos, which were cardio and resp exam. And then the rest is kind of history. We just kept doing it and kept doing it. And it's now grown far beyond what I'd expected. I think we've had over 250 million views of our content from a global audience. So way, way bigger than I anticipated. I was just kind of hoping I could get a few people in my year group on board using it, to be honest. So now I work on Geeky Medics alongside my training and alongside teaching clinical skills at a medical school nearby. So it's quite a varied week, which, is really fun, but also has its own challenges. So at the moment, I do 2 days Geeky Medics, 2 days GP, and 1 day teaching clinical skills for OSCEs. So that's kind of Geeky Medics' I guess, genesis. And then these days now, really, my interests are in trying to, build a platform that's really helpful for people wanting to, when they just start learning clinical skills, which is, I'm sure many people listening can relate to how intimidating it is when you start having to, prepare for things like OSCEs and learning what they are and how you should be acting and dealing well with, carrying out these things under pressure. And as someone who took 7 times to pass their driving test back when I was a teenager, I can relate to the challenges of performing, these kinds of skills under pressure. But thankfully, I did manage to get through my OSCEs. So I guess now my expertise lies in, still trying to refine my ability to be a GP and my comm skills, but also now I feel like I've got a pretty good grasp of what an OSCE is and how to teach, students how to perform well in OSCEs. So that's kind of where I get probably the most enjoyment of my week now is getting to help out at the medical school. And also with the local paramedic school as well, which is at the same place.
That's awesome. Firstly, congratulations on the success of Geeky Medics. That's absolutely insane, particularly when you started that, so long ago as well, and it's still just growing, which is fantastic. What I love as well is in terms of your OSCEs, it's such like you said, under pressure, stress, we all get a bit frazzled, we forget things, and particularly when you're in these situations, whether that be as a paramedic, student, nursing student or medical student, it doesn't matter what it is. We all sort of experience that stress, experience the anxiety of if I'm going to forget something inside that OSCE room, if I fail, it can become a really crux of sort of your moving on in your degree. And there's not a lot of learning and education around OSCEs. And as you said, this is something that you do quite a bit with medical students and everything. So do you want to go through what an OSCE is, firstly, particularly for those people that might just be starting out in their degrees? And also, I guess, the ways to prepare and set themselves up for success when it comes to getting into that room and performing that OSCE.
Yeah, sure. So an OSCE is an objective structured clinical examination. So the idea is that you sort of performing a given skill under the eyes of, someone else who's examining you and marking you generally against some kind of mark scheme. And usually these are sort of used for assessments as part of training across most healthcare professions and in lots of other industries as well. And by their nature, they are somewhat stressful because you can sometimes, perform poorly on an OSCE, even though actually you did know the skill, just because, often these sort of stations, as they're called, last, 8 minutes or something like that. And in that 8 minutes, if things can go wrong, you can come out maybe with a mark that doesn't really represent actually what you're capable of. So I think that's probably what people find quite intimidating, much like a driving test and all these other things. You're sort of scrutinized under quite a high pressured situation. So half of the sort of battle with OSCEs is just getting better generally at performing under that kind of someone observing you and it being a relatively high pressure situation. So I think one thing that I always kind of try and tell students, having, I now participate as an examiner in the OSCEs. And it's interesting being on the other side of it, because I think in my brain, when I was a student, I kind of felt like the examiners were looking for ways I was messing up and looking for things I hadn't done. And I don't know why I had that sense, but I guess that's just probably how it feels at the time. But actually being on the other side of it, essentially, you desperately want to give someone as many marks as you possibly can. And I know that's not just me, speaking to all the other examiners. And in some ways, it feels quite stressful being an examiner because you want to make sure you're doing that person proud, essentially, and that you'll make sure they get the marks they deserve and that you don't miss them doing something and don't get to give them the marks. So I think it's sometimes helpful, to reframe in your mind that, examiners aren't out to get you or to trip you up. Generally, they're desperately wanting to give you as many marks as they possibly can. So really, they're just wanting you to show them. I think something else that, again, I wish I'd known more when I was practicing, is that it's not a one-way street. I think it feels like under the pressure when you're in, doing a respiratory exam or whatever, if you've practiced everything in a specific order, and then on the day, under the pressure, you forget to do some specific thing that you would normally always do, but because of the pressure, you haven't. And you realize that towards the end of the session. But the reality is these mark schemes, they're not set in a way that, it's a one-way train. And then once you've passed the station, once you've passed that particular point, you can't go back. So I always say, certainly if you remember something at the time, just say, oh, sorry, I would normally do this, and then do it. Or the examiner might say, no, that's fine, continue, you'll get the mark anyway. Because they're just looking to check that that you at least should have done that. And obviously in real life, we don't do things in a perfectly structured way every single time. That's not really going to have any influence on the outcome. Obviously, there's, when it comes to A, B, C, D, E and stuff, there's a bit more of a rigidity there. But generally, the way in which we approach things can be a bit chaotic. And as long as you do it all, that's fine. So I think if you notice that you've sort of messed something up, or you've missed something, you can go back and do it again. And particularly if you find yourself sat at the end of an OSCE and you've got a minute or two to spare, just sitting there, and if you've got a pen and paper or in your own head, just going back through and thinking, okay, what did I do? What does this exam involve? And if you think of something you haven't done, again, get back up and do it. Because examiners will give you the marks, because I've never been in any situation in an OSCE where the mark scheme says that you can't retrospectively give marks. If someone, once you leave the room, then it's kind of game over. But as long as you're in the room and the time isn't up, you can just, grab more marks. So I think those are two tips that I think, knowing that examiners actually want to give you as many marks as possible, and knowing that if you don't do things in the perfect order, you can still quite easily grab those marks later. And it's not the end of the world that you didn't do it in the ideal sequence. So those are probably two of the big ones that come up regularly with students, and certainly when I'm an examiner, it's what I want to be able to tell them, but I can't.
Absolutely, they're really good points. And I mean, like you said, it's kind of like real life. You're not going to be remembering everything off by heart in a particular order, unless obviously, doctor's ABC and doing your ABCDE approach. But even then, I mean, if you take, an OSCE the same way you treat sort of your stress in real life, I know with paramedics in particular, taking a breath as you arrive on scene in real life is obviously really important, because you might be carrying a lot of stress into that scene, depending on what it may be. And then trying to follow that real systematic approach in what you can. And that's really important in pre-hospital. Your ABCD approach, secondary survey, all of that. So I feel like it always comes back to that really structured, systematic approach. And that's something that critical care paramedics, flight paramedics, doctors, everyone have sort of said constantly as a way to bring them back down from being in that heightened anxiety sort of space, and bringing them back down to a space in which they can actually work with a clear head. So I feel like that's a really important part as well when you go into OSCEs, is just think this is really systematic, just take a breath and just focus on how you'd sort of try, or how you would attempt to do it in real life as well.
Yeah, so having these structures, and this is kind of where your practice comes in, so having those relatively well embedded in your memory. So for, as you said, like an emergency or pre-hospital situation, that might be your ABCDE, so that if you get you sort of find yourself a bit lost and your mind goes blank, you can just go back to that structure that you can remember and go, okay, well, what? The airway was clear, breathing, stats are okay. Oh yeah, but I haven't actually auscultated yet. I'll auscultate now. And that sometimes can just be what you need to get you back on track. And it, the same applies to things like in a musculoskeletal exam. Often structures like look, feel, move special tests is a common one, which is really just inspection, palpation, assessing range of movement, and then doing X-rings. Having those in the back of your mind, so that if you get lost, you can just think, okay, look, feel, move. Okay, I did feel, I'll go to move now. can help. When you get derailed, get back. And I think the other thing you talked about, taking a deep breath and sort of resetting, I think that's really important in an OSCE, because even if, you have a dreadful station where things don't go as planned at all, and you walk out, and then in a minute you're going to be walking into your next station, what you need to remember, first of all, is that what's done is done. That door is sealed. That's fine. I know it's hard as it is, try and completely forget about that for now, because that next room you're going to walk into, it's a new examiner, it's a new patient. They don't know anything about what's just happened in the other room. And if you carry that, stress with you about a station going wrong, it can have a significant impact on, the next 2 or 3 stations. When in reality, it's a completely clean slate from, a new examiner, new patient perspective. So I think getting good at being able to sort of just say, okay, well, that's done. Forget about that. I can think about that after the exam and, critically analyze my performance. But for right now, I just need to deal with what's in front of me and what's the next thing. So yeah, I think that's probably one of these other things, is not letting one disaster, feed through into other stations. I mean, I had a friend who walked into a station and sort of squirted some alcohol gel to wash their hands, did it a bit too vigorously, so there was someone on the floor, and then managed to slip over in this pool, and then had to, was quite upset, and then had to traipse on to the next station, and didn't do as well in the next station as well, because they still kind of carried that upset and stress with them. And that's quite a bad situation, obviously. But speaking to them after, they said they just kind of wished that they just left it in that room, because the reality was no one outside of that room knew that happened. So I think being aware of that and practicing so that those structures are in place deep in your memory. So even under intense stress, whilst you might not be able to remember clever details and clever signs and what these signs mean, you at least have that base sort of map of what you should be doing in a station to get you back on track. Because often it is just, you need a bit of reorientation. You need to remember where you're at, and then everything flows from there. But I think, 10 seconds of silence when you can't remember what to do in the context of an OSCE feels like 3 minutes. So that's really where the practice comes into play.
Absolutely.
Because you'll never have a perfect OSCE. And I say this to students all the time, that I think another thing to be aware of is you'll never do a station and think, I did everything I possibly could there. There'll be always things that go differently, I once walked into a station and introduced myself as John, despite, being Lewis, because the night before I was practicing with a fake patient named John. And, just obviously I normally get my own name right, but under the pressure of the first station in an OSCE, that all went out the window. But thankfully I managed to recoup it so that, the future stations, I knew my own name, and I was able to perform okay. So weird things can happen, expect them to happen, but you just need a strategy to get back on track when they do. Just plan for them to happen, because they will, undoubtedly.
Absolutely. I really love that, because there's no way that anything ever goes perfectly. And I've heard so many people have unfortunate stories in their OSCEs, but you bring up such a really important point, which is have those strategies in place to bring you back to, an appropriate, spot where you can go ahead again, because that not only happens in your OSCE, but it's going to happen in real life as well. And it's such an important part. And I guess it comes back to the cliche of, you never, you don't fall back to what is it? Oh no, I'm going to forget it. I'm going to botch it really badly. But something along the lines of, you always fall back to the level of your training anyway. So if you're training for these strategies to help bring you back on track, you'll just do it automatically, or hopefully think about it for a second and be able to get ahead and go again. Because I don't think I've ever had a perfect OSCE or a perfect scenario, and that's perfectly fine. I guess it happens.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think, ABCD and stuff like that, I can recall many, many times when in middle of a night shift on a ward and there's a medical emergency and I'm stressed and I think, what on earth am I going to do next? And I think ABCD, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And it just brings me back down to something that I know and that I've got a bit of control over. So it continues to apply throughout. And, obviously for paramedics in the pre-hospital setting is, again, core and regularly relied upon as a system. And I think I was listening to one of your other podcasts before, and I was agreeing with the fact that you were talking about essentially, whilst in an ABCD assessment, you don't really need to spend too much time interpreting and understanding exactly what pathophysiology is happening. You just need the basics that you need to treat. Oxygen levels are low. Okay, those need to be treated. I don't quite at this minute need to know exactly why they're low. That will come with time. But for now, I need, I've detected this abnormality. I'm going to put into place an intervention and I'm going to reassess. And that higher level diagnostics and stuff can come in a little bit, but it's not as important initially. And I think, this applies to all sorts of areas of life, I think. But yeah, ABCD is golden for that stuff.
Absolutely. Even a strategy I've used as a grad paramedic is, if I'm going to a case and I feel a bit overwhelmed, or if we've gotten to a point where we're sort of stopped, is to go through and I relay it out loud to my partner, and I'm like, okay, airway is sorted, it's clear. Breathing, yep, they've got 15 litres of oxygen on right now, their respirator is this, that, it's all sorted at the moment. And just go through like that so that we're all on the same page. I've voiced it in a way, makes me feel a little bit more clear with the situation, and provides an opportunity for my partner to also interject and be like, no, hey, we've missed this, or let's do this. And it's just a way to, instead of just being in my head crowding and going through, a million miles an hour, I can actually just say, hey, like, we've got a second, let's go through this. What have we missed, or what can we do now? Or are we at the right point now in which we can transport? And I find that just taking a second and doing what works for you is always best. So having practiced that, it's always the best way of doing it.
Yeah, and bringing that back to OSCEs, I think that strategy of speaking out loud about your thought process can also be a good strategy in an OSCE. So I think for certain elements of an OSCE, it's sometimes quite hard as the examiner to know if someone has done the thing or thought about the thing. And, if someone comes in and they talk through and they go, yeah, I've inspected the joint and I've assessed the range of movement, and then I've done this. As the examiner, it makes it super easy to give them the marks because they're essentially demonstrating their thinking, but it's also helping the student, check in their own head what they've done so far and if there's anything they've missed. So I've never been in a situation where doing that would be a negative. So I think if that works for you, and narrating essentially or summarizing to yourself, even if you've not got a partner to share it with in that context, it makes it incredibly obvious to the examiner what stuff you're thinking about or what you've done. And it can help, again, keep you on track and maybe remind you of things you've missed and you want to go back to.
Absolutely. And what do you, as an examiner, find some of the common things missed by students in the OSCE?
Yeah, so to be honest, often the things that I think naturally the things that people get stressed about in an OSCE are like technical skills and the clever bits and all the fidgety bits. So, in a venipuncture station, you see the student walk in and see the equipment and the dreaded plastic arm and think, oh no, this is going to be really fidgety. And then what happens is, because they're so in their mind, then probably jumping ahead and trying to think about what angle the needle needs to go in the arm, etc., that they're forgetting all of the basics. So suddenly they forget to introduce themselves, or they forget to gain consent from the patient, or they do things like they put loads of alcohol gel in their hands and then immediately try and put rubber gloves on, which is a bad idea, because then they get sort of half on and half stuck, and then they're getting stressed because, it's an exam situation and they can't get their own gloves on their own hands. So in those moments, it's often worth just thinking, actually, there's loads of marks available for the really basic things. And, the angle of the needle going in or whether or not you get blood are not going to be the things that mean you pass or fail. At worst, they're probably 2 or 3 marks at worst. But actually, there's a mark for introducing yourself properly, for confirming the patient's details. There's a mark for, gaining consent. There's a mark for actually washing your hands, and then probably a mark for putting on your gloves. So when you compare, the weighting there's loads more marks available for really basic things. But I think the natural tendency is to really stress and sort of zone in and hyper focus on the technical element of the station, and then you lose all of this easy, low-hanging fruit. So I think being tactical and knowing that those marks are there to be taken. And there's nothing more frustrating as an examiner that you can't give someone marks for that stuff because they just haven't done it. So you just can't give them the marks. So I think be tactical, make sure that you get the basics right. Those specific technical details are rarely the reason you would pass or fail. They're often, at worst, the kind of things that differentiate someone from being like a merit versus the distinction or whatever. But don't forget those very basic things. And to be honest, I think if you walk in and you introduce yourself well and you sort of get the consent of the patient and you have like a good patient manner, that often diffuses a lot of the tension, I think, and the stress internally. Because if you've opened well like that, often you then feel quite a bit more relaxed about the whole situation. And I think as well, you get some confidence from the examiner because the examiner thinks, okay, this person, is approached, it's a strong start. And often if someone has quite a strong start, you sort of, in a way, you become a bit less hawkish and a bit less, concerned that maybe they're not competent at the skill, etc. Because you think, no, they seem really natural. They seem really confident. It's fine. So having a sort of strong, confident opening where you collect all those easy marks, I think is a key strategy in an OSCE to do well.
That's a really good point. And it just comes back to the notion of your basics are incredibly important. And that's pretty much in everything across the board. And I love how it can even tie into that of the OSCE, which is really fantastic. So you're going through sort of introductions, the stress of OSCEs and how to sort of alleviate that as well. What would be your final top tips for absolutely acing your OSCE or doing as best as you can?
It's a difficult one. So I guess obviously there's specific advice for certain stations. I think certainly making sure that the basic things that you're in a good state of mind for an OSCE. So making sure that you've obviously practiced beforehand, practiced with friends and colleagues. Because I think one of the challenges of OSCEs, from what I've heard from students over the years, is that often you receive one session on a skill, maybe one expert demonstration, and then you kind of left to your own devices. So that's often when it's really helpful to find, other people that are willing to practice with you and attending mock OSCEs, maybe even with groups of people that you don't normally hang out with as regularly, so you're a bit less comfortable around them. That often helps sort of create it's never going to be as intense a stress, but a bit more sort of sense of stress when you're trying to perform a skill. Because really what you're trying to do is condition yourself to be used to having those situations, so that you don't go from, being completely comfortable with, the one person in your course that you always practice with to a complete stranger examiner and stranger patient. So I personally find that helpful, and I've heard from other students that they find it helpful if somebody, a society puts on a mock OSCE in advance of it. It's always worth taking those opportunities. And I've had other friends who have gone out of their way to sort of set up their own mock OSCE where they invite people from the year group to play the various roles, and then do it that way. So mock OSCEs for me are probably one of the most effective ways to sort of condition yourself and prepare for the day. Because I think we all know just, reading about a skill or even watching a YouTube video on a skill, that's not enough to walk in and do really, really well on a particular station. It's all about that, having a bit of adrenaline, bit of uncertainty, maybe people you're not quite used to. So that's probably, in terms of a strategy that applies to all types of station, I would definitely do it. And the advantage often, the ways that I've seen this work best, is when everyone has to contribute like a station. So, there's 5 of you or there's 10 of you, say, and you all have to create your own station, which means that you get to revise something quite deep and know about it. And then maybe you play the examiner for part of the session on that station, but then other people create their own stations too. So then everyone kind of learns something quite well that they can assess other people on. But you all benefit from the variety that you bring to the table. So I think that is a really solid strategy if you can find, 5 or 10 people to do that. And it can just be at someone's house. When I used to do it, it was at someone's house. like a shared house, and then each of the rooms would become a station, and you would put, you know, little bits of paper in a salad bowl, which were sort of which rooms you would go to next, to sort of create a bit of randomness to it. So there's loads of ways to do it, and you know, obviously, bit of a plug, but we've got an OSCE station platform now that's completely free to create your own stations and even set up group practice. So if you wanted to do it using the platform, you can definitely do that. And you can even print out your stations quite easily from the platform as well. So that's probably my sort of catch-all tip.
I love those. Those are fantastic. And I even think it comes back to what we talk about quite a lot on this podcast with so many different guests, is just getting comfortable, being uncomfortable, and putting up your hand to nominate yourself to do that scenario in front of your classmates, because the more you practice inside that classroom and inside those scenarios, the better prepared you're going to be when you go do a scenario in an OSCE, because your skills are going to translate over, hopefully, and you're not going into that OSCE having never done a scenario in front of other people. So realistically, at the end of the day, it's about sort of building your own cognitive bandwidth in a way in which it's not going to become extremely narrowed all of a sudden when you go into that OSCE room, because you're familiar with having done so in your tutorials and things like that, which is quite a common thing we see in paramedic students. They don't want to do the scenario, so they sit at the back of the class and don't want to be volunteered, because it can be scary. But at the end of the day, it's going to help you when you have to go do those scenarios and those exams for OSCEs.
Absolutely. I think it's just sort of training yourself so that you don't release an outrageous amount of adrenaline when you walk in. I think that's really what goes on often, is that just because if you repeatedly expose yourself to a similar situation beforehand, then you don't, you know, your adrenal glands don't eject quite as much adrenaline, and therefore you feel a bit less overwhelmed, and, you know, a few less palpitations, and you can't quite hear the pulse in your ears, etc. Which, you know, I think I'm the personality type that would, in a group context, when someone says, well, who wants to go next? I'm not the person that would say, me, please. I have to kind of push myself to do that, because I know it's good for me in the long run, even if it feels horrible and I mess up in front of everyone and I look a bit silly because I don't know how to do X or Y. Much better to experience that before the day than on the day. So, you know, I think that's what it is. It's just kind of putting yourself forward in these situations to help out. And I would go to mock OSCE sessions, even though I really didn't really feel like it, and it was all a bit awkward, and I didn't know all the people there. But in hindsight, I think actually that awkwardness and unfamiliarity and stuff was quite helpful training for the day, because really you know, it continues when you qualify, right, as a paramedic or as a doctor, because, you know, when you go to your first medical emergency on a ward or, you know, pre-hospital, again, you got loads of adrenaline, and you know, your mind goes blank and you're not quite sure what you're doing. And then, you know, down the road, you've been to 50 of them. You're not necessarily loads more knowledgeable at that point, but that your physiological response to the situation is much more blunted. And I remember being in Australia when I was living in Melbourne, and some friends had bought me a skydive because they knew I'm really scared of heights. They thought it was very funny as a gift for me leaving the UK. So I had to do it, and also get the video of it, of course. And I was speaking to the guy I was strapped to in the plane, who, you know, does this every day. And obviously I'm, you know, having palpitations, very stressed. And I look at this guy, and he's got his phone and he's ordering his Deliveroo for the landing zone for his lunch. And he's, you know, for him, it's just, it doesn't matter. And we've probably all experienced this when we see senior colleagues and senior teachers in situations that we think, you know, we would just be incredibly overwhelmed, and they look cool as a cucumber. And it's just that repeated exposure that they've gone through. And I asked this guy on the plane, I said, do you get any, you know, stress or stuff? He said, no, I feel nothing. So he said, I just feel hungry. So he had that clarity that he was focused on other things at that point. I think it's the exact same mechanisms at play. So
I love that. I'm going to think about that next time when I'm stressed in a situation. Be like, oh, Deliveroo.
Exactly.
No, I love that. That's fantastic.
Exactly. You want to be so good at your OSCEs that you're just thinking about what you're going to be having for dinner afterwards. That's your biggest concern.
Absolutely. I feel like that's the takeaway of today, right?
Yeah.
So I was going to go into clinical assessment with you, but I think our OSCE chat has been absolutely fantastic, and it's taken up, you know, a good chunk of time anyway.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to sort of convolute this message anyway. I feel like OSCEs are a very stressful part of degrees, and everyone puts such an onus of it or importance on it. So I really appreciate you delving into this topic with me. I feel like you're the best man for it, because Geeky Medics is obviously a fantastic platform to prepare you for your OSCEs anyway. Do you want to chat a little bit more about sort of, you mentioned there you've got your Geeky Medics, you've got your OSCE sort of, I guess, generator platform there that you can do. And do you want to go into a little bit about that before we sign off?
Yeah, I could briefly mention it. So we've got lots of essentially how-to guides on all of the key exams on geekymedics.com. They're all free. So most of them have a video demonstration and then a written guide as well, and a PDF checklist. So that's all free and accessible. And then on the geekyquiz.com sort of part of the website, we have the OSCE stations platform where you can make your own stations. And we even have templates. So if you can't quite be bothered making your own checklist, you can sort of create a scenario and then say, oh, I want a abdominal examination template, and then it'll sort of autofill the checklist, and then you can tweak it to, you know, suit you and what your medical school or your, you know, paramedic school teaches. So I would encourage you to check that out, and because all that stuff is free. We do have paid things as well, but I'm not going to push those, because I think you'll get most of the value out of the free stuff. And if you like the other things, feel free to obviously support, but no pressure. And we just, quite exciting this morning, actually, we announced that we've got a book coming out in the next, I think it'll be shipping in early February. But yeah, if you're interested in a book about clinical examination, that should be shipping worldwide from February. We're just doing the proofreading now, but it does exist. It's essentially the website guides, which are free, but in a sort of a bit more of a distilled format. And really, we've done it because I know some people just love a book. I'm less of a book person, so I've ignored it for the last decade when people have asked it. And I've kind of thought, you know, books are dead. I was thinking books are dead 12 years ago when I started. But turns out, you know, they're still around and they have a place alongside all of these clever online things. So I've had to sort of acknowledge that and do the book. But the book has lots of QR codes, of course, to quickly take you to the relevant video, or listen to some respiratory lung sounds, or to do an OSCE station, or to do some flashcards, etc. So whilst it is a book, it definitely has some digital roots to it. So yeah, keep an eye out for that if you're interested. But that's probably it.
Amazing. And so if anyone needs to find you, you guys are on all the social medias, and obviously you got geekymedics as well.com. So I feel like I'll put those all into the show notes so everyone can click straight away and have a browse through and get straight onto it and start practicing for their OSCEs.
Great. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. You can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or you can email us at thestudentparamedicpodcast@gmail.com.